people were freaking out. And you already have enough of the sentiment in Canada specifically that, Canadians can't afford homes, can't afford to buy them. You've got people on different political sides of the spectrum as well, where you hear a lot of it about corporations buying up all the property, right? I watch people in our industry take this and just spin it out to Canadians will never own property again. The corporations will own everything. And then, of course, people get upset. And it was never accurate to begin with.
What is it about the mortgage industry that drives you absolutely nuts?
I think when you look at the mortgage space right now, the thing that drives me crazy is that there's not proper education for people that enter the mortgage industry, and the barrier to entry is way too small. Right. So I think when you look at, real estate agents as well, mortgage brokers, it's literally a correspondence course that you go through, and then you have a license and you're able to represent the industry the same way that anybody else has been in it. And there's no distinction between somebody that's been in the industry with, 20 years of experience and thousands of files versus the brand new person, right? That brand new person in today's world, especially, could put up a ton of crazy marketing, websites, all those other things, and be able to drive traffic and then ultimately drop the ball. And it represents the industry negatively at the end of the day.
Yeah, you nailed the point, which is there's nothing stopping. The barrier to entry is very low.
Yeah.
The tools required to make you look good are quite accessible nowadays.
Yeah.
So what is it that really separates you? If you're getting into the industry, you can get the tools really easily. The barrier to entry is what is it that actually separates you? What has made you go from 20 million a year to 150 million a year?
Yeah, and I think two different questions that you're asking, right? So the difference between somebody that is new to the industry or not at the same success level is knowledge and application for the client specifically, right? The difference between my ability to guide a client that comes to my office with my 20 years of experience versus somebody that's brand new, wildly different, And again, there are even the most simplest types of clients, first-time buyers, salaried individuals, pretty straightforward. You can literally fill out an application at RBC online and spit out what you're qualified for. But, the process of buying a home is incredibly emotional for most Canadians, right? Can I afford it is the first question that everybody has. And once they know they can afford it, okay, great, I can afford it. What are the payments? What does the budget look like? Okay, and how do I buy it? What does it mean for me after the fact, right? What are penalties and prepayment privileges, and how do I actually make this mortgage work for me, right? The difference between a top-level mortgage professional and your entry-level professional is in the details of that transaction for that client. And then the difference between, somebody at 20 and 100, is systems specifically. And it's the same for a lot of different other industries. When you look, the people that have really optimized systems, throughout their business, you see them operate at a very high level because they have the ability to continue to grow without everything breaking.
The systems you're talking about, what is the biggest change that you did? What is the system you implemented that you saw the biggest dynamic shift in your business?
Yeah, I think in the broker industry or any sales industry, it's really your CRM system, right? Your ability to be able to track your customers from start to finish and replicate a process for those individuals that has been designed at the highest level to create an incredible experience for them. When we look at people that, don't have incredible systems, they're just winging it from day to day with each customer, and they miss things here or there, or maybe forget to do this. Or if the customer ever comes back to them in the future, they don't have that person's information appropriately. So for us, we really dialed in what I feel is like one of the best systems in the mortgage industry so that we can create that client experience that is of the highest level from start to finish and never screw it up.
Recently, there was a news release about a change in FSMA or OSFI or
OSFI. Yeah.
And this isn't the first time this has happened, but an announcement comes out, and in today's day and age, everything is about, there's this mentality where as soon as content or information comes out, we need to get it out to our customer. And it's not uncommon for that information to be misinterpreted or regurgitated the wrong way.
Right.
Does it matter to be first? Is it better to delay? What's happening? What's your thoughts?
I think it depends on what your goals are, right? So if you want eyeballs and attention, being first is fantastic, right? If you're the first person to get it out there, people will see it, they'll react to it, and we do live in a world of attention today. that's great for certain things, you know, like news events that are super straightforward. You know, Trump tweeted this, right? You know, so being able to put that out, cool. But when you work in like a highly technical industry, and, you know, everything that comes out in our industry, it can be convoluted sometimes. It usually requires some kind of clarification. And, you know, if you took one thing out of context and then spun it out to the world, you know, whether it's social media, it's your newsletter, etc., you're really doing a disservice, you know, to Canadians by putting inaccurate information out there. And unfortunately, the world that we live in today, you know, with social media, it's incredibly polarized, right? I watched that announcement specifically, and in essence, you know, not fantastic for Canadians, the way that people interpreted it, which was you can only use your income for one mortgage. It can't be double counted. It had nothing to do with that. It was actually, you know, about the bank's capital adequacy requirements. So their own internal risk and balance sheet is what it had to do. But people were freaking out, right? And you already have enough of the sentiment in Canada specifically that, you know, Canadians can't afford homes, can't afford to buy them. You know, you've got people on different political sides of the spectrum as well, where, you know, specifically in the US, you hear a lot of it about corporations buying up all the property, right? Yep. And so I watch people in our industry take this and just spin it out to Canadians will never own property again. The corporations will own everything. And then, of course, you know, people get upset, you know, when they see that. And it was never accurate to begin with.
There is this sentiment, like everything right now is clickbait, right? It's all about the titles and the headlines and the thumbnails. Yep. And the overall consensus seems to be doom and gloom. Yeah. Is that really what you see happening? Is that are we destined to never own homes? Are we destined to live a life of never being able to retire because we'll have no equity in our homes? What do you actually see? What is the truth? What are we actually supposed to be paying attention to?
I think Canadians as a whole, and even North Americans, you know, we've been through the most wild last 6 years, right? You know, when we look at it, we had this crazy event of the pandemic, right? Most of us have never lived through a pandemic ever in our lives, right? I keep hearing everybody tell me, I like to just stop living through unprecedented times for once in my life, right? And so, you know, we go through the COVID, which is this crazy event. You know, everybody's locked in their house. You know, the financial world kind of changes. Debt is almost, you know, completely free at one point in time. Interest rates are as low. You know, we had clients with fixed rates at 1.79%. You know, it's the cheapest money you're ever going to get. And then now we've come out of that with inflation going crazy, right? You know, you also have people that suffered from a job position, you know, throughout COVID, right? And then we came out of that. We came into a high inflation environment. You know, life was expensive for Canadians. Canadians as a whole just wildly taxed across the board. So, you know, living here and actually thriving has been very difficult. And when you look at the cost of housing, specifically in our two major markets in Canada, you know, BC and Ontario, you know, it's expensive, right? We've also had record immigration, you know, for the last 10 years here in Canada. Some of it has been required because, again, we're not populating Canada fast enough. The birth rates have been going down here in Canada as far as, you know, us reproducing. So we do have to bring in, you know, new Canadians. We also need to bring in talent as well, right? You know, we have a lack of talent in certain sectors and our productivity sucks as well, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that, you know, aren't great as far as kind of the state of Canada, but your ability to be able to own a home, it still exists. And I think that a lot of Canadians, unfortunately, have been sold this theory that you could never own property here.
But is it owning a home in the place you want to live?
Yeah.
Or is it just owning a home in general?
Cool. Yeah. And this is a conversation that I think, unfortunately, we have to some degree been robbed of the dream of, hey, I grew up here, you know, I want to live here and I'm going to raise my family in the same place I was raised. You know, I grew up in Steveston in British Columbia, right? And when I grew up there, it was a fishing village. On Wednesdays, you could smell the cannery and the fish, right? You know, and now it's this beautiful place that everybody aspires to be. But, you know, the homes are, you know, over $2 million for something that's 2,500 square feet, you know, and for a majority of people, it's not affordable, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that people do have to maybe shift what life looks like as far as owning property. And, you know, that's sometimes difficult depending upon what you do for work, right? So if you work in the downtown core, right, of Vancouver and you want to own a home, they are wildly unaffordable. But if you could work out, in the suburbs, right, or you could live in the suburbs and commute in, is it ideal? No, it's not ideal. But could you still own property? Yes. So, it also comes with a plan. I don't think a lot of Canadians have a plan for actually owning a home one day. They've just given up. They've just said, forget it. I'll never be able to afford it, right?
Where's that sentiment coming from? What is causing people to believe that? I mean, is it headlines?
It's media, right? I mean, realistically, and you do see like obviously Instagram and other things like that where, properties, you see the like $2 million property in like Spain and it's a castle, right?
Yeah.
And then
everyone's moving to Italy for $1.
Yeah. And then you see like the $2 million property in Vancouver and it's a teardown, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it has fed, the idea that it's not affordable, you'll never own anything. And people, that haven't necessarily had the opportunity to have help from family, because that's very, prolific in Canada today, is, our parents' generation passing down wealth from their home ownership to now allow their children to get into the market. There is a lot of it that happens, but there's tons of people that have given up. But what I've seen, realistic, we've had all this immigration. All these immigrants that are actually coming to Canada and are permanent residents now, they're buying property, right? Mm-hmm. Because the expectation of what they are owed from society is not the same as, those of us who maybe were raised here, right? They will buy a 2-bedroom condo and live there with, the parents and the 2 kids, right? And they make it work, So the idea of home ownership, it's not the same idea of the white picket fence on the, cul-de-sac that we once had. And, I think people need to start to figure out, okay, maybe I was raised in BC my whole life. Maybe it is too expensive now for me to be in a home that is a fit for me and my family. What other opportunities exist for me inside of Canada, right? You've seen mass migration to like provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan at this point in time, very different climatically, from where we are at here in BC, but still affordable housing. I mean, there's duplexes available in Alberta right now for, 500, 600,000. And for your average Canadian making, 50, 60,000, a household of 2 people, you making 120,000 household income, you could buy a home that's a duplex to raise your family in one of those provinces. So, maybe the expectations are just needing to shift slightly at this point in time.
You did a video about immigration and it managed to spur quite a reaction in the comment section.
Yeah.
There's this understanding that immigrants are a huge reason for the increased price and unaffordability crisis.
Yeah.
And it looked like from your research that you were able to find that it was less than 1% of the actual overall effect came from immigration.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that, the immigration misperspective, and also what actually did cause this chaos that is the housing crisis, in your opinion? What is making housing so unaffordable?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I don't think it's one simple answer, but let's first talk about immigration. And I think immigration is such a hot topic because we've watched the fabric of communities in Canada change, fundamentally in the last 10 years, right? With the immigration that we have had. And without getting super political on it, right? We just brought in way too many people, not necessarily permanent residents, but, when you look at, the temporary foreign workers program, it's been abused, by corporations. That's now coming out at this point in time. We've had tons of students here on visas, and so people, they see their community changing that they were raised in or that they're living in. And then it's very easy to blame immigration when it comes to housing prices. I think that's more impactful on the actual rental market than it is on the housing market itself. Maybe it spurs some of the investment that we've seen. And this is why you're seeing the condo crisis in BC and Ontario at this point in time, because developers were incentivized to build, what are known as the dog crate condos, right? These tiny little units, because students, right, would, rent those from investors, right? It's not Canadians that live here that are buying that product. It's not end user product. It's investment product, right?
So what you're seeing is you're seeing the student population come to Canada, go to school.
Yep.
You're seeing these developers build these micro condos or small dog kennel condos.
Yeah.
And then you're seeing foreign investors buy those condos and rent them to foreign students.
Yep. Or even local investors. But, again, you have to remember there was a foreign buyer ban, in British Columbia specifically here, for, I can't remember when they enacted it, but it's brutal, right?
2020.
Yeah.
2019, happened just before COVID.
Yeah, in that time frame, right? And it's impactful. I mean, the tax on it is massive. Right? It basically deters anybody from buying property that, can't live here. Right?
But was it really that impactful? I mean, at the end of the day, wasn't the appreciation over the last 4 years bigger than the tax you would have paid on those properties? I mean, it was a gamble at first, but I think the appreciation was actually higher.
Yeah, I mean, but the tax was 20%, right? So when you look at the upfront capital cost on that, right? Yeah, so sure, the appreciation was crazy through COVID, right?
You were not going to be able to predict it.
Yeah, you wouldn't have been able to predict it. You would have been better off just putting that money into, mutual funds and, index funds, et cetera, that have performed well as well.
But then you also have this double whammy, which is, sure, you put a 20% tax on it, but the Canadian dollar was also at an all-time low. Oh, yeah. So if you're coming in with a higher valued currency into a country, paying a 20% tax isn't actually that big of a hit with in a market that's been consistently appreciating at more than 10% per year.
Fair. And I mean, you did see a ton of foreign money pour into Canada, from the 90s forward, right? Yeah. That's certainly something that had happened. I just don't think that when you look at immigration specifically based on the statistics, that's what's driving home prices, right? No. So when you look at home prices specifically, you look at British Columbia, okay? It is one of the most beautiful places in the world. I think we take it for granted sometimes, totally. Being surrounded by mountains, ocean, we have the interior as well. It's kind of like wine country. Like, where do you get all of that, in one place, right? So it is a world-class place to live, but when you look at the cost of housing specifically, there is not enough space in BC. So we're surrounded by mountains and ocean, right? So you can't build out. It's not like we're the prairies where you can just keep building out and out and out and out, and there's more and more space, right? There's only limited amount of space in downtown Vancouver. And so when you look at that, there's nowhere to go but up. And so more and more people keep moving here or want to move here, property values go up. And again, you noted Canadian dollar has never really been super strong as far as a world currency is concerned, and you have people that are allowed to immigrate here, so certainly, back in the 90s, we had, a ton of money that came here out of China, or outside of China, Taiwan, fleeing, Chinese rule. And you watch, certain communities blow up inside of, Vancouver real estate. And still, you look at Richmond specifically, where we're at today shooting this podcast, is very Asian, right? Because again, they were able to come here, build a life here and continue on. So I think immigration, certainly has a part on it. A large part of it, though, is also geographically, there's just not a lot of space left in BC. And then on top of that, you have so much government bureaucracy that is tied into it.
There we go. Yeah. So that's the big thing. And I think that's the thing that not many people speak to. And you're hearing this massive debate. You're looking at all these thumbnails and these clickbait titles, but they're not talking about the fact that one of the biggest reasons that property is so expensive is the bureaucracy behind it. Yeah. With the average developer taking up to 3 years before they can put a shovel in the ground. Yep. And so that holding time, that cost is being passed through to the end consumer.
It's not even the holding time. So, the holding time is certainly a part of it, but the other portion of it specifically is all of the permitting fees and everything else that are tied into those developers that, of course, they get passed on. And so much of it is just unnecessary, as far as the government just making their piece on real estate. And so let's just talk just a little bit about kind of the government and how much money they make off of real estate, right? So not only do they have all of their development fees that are passed on to developers, but then when we buy property in British Columbia, right? Anybody buys property, we all pay property transfer tax as well. So they're then taxing the property that you're acquiring, right? There's GST as well on all of those new units. Now, finally this year, first-time buyers are waiving that, as part of new rules coming from the Carney government, et cetera. But realistically, the amount of taxes that are built, just again, on our income, our property, it just never ends. And so you go, cool, is it yeah, it's wildly unaffordable at this point, right?
The key takeaway from all of this and from everything I'm seeing is nothing is actually stopping us from being able to buy a house. There's nothing infringing on my right to buy a house. There are variables that are impacting my ability to buy a house and afford a house. One is the fact that in the last 24 years, we've had unprecedented, that freaking word, amounts of inflation and appreciation in properties. We've had a huge amount of foreign buyers come into the market. Yep. We've had more bureaucracy put in place. Yep. We are running out of the ability to develop in specific zones, right? Downtown Toronto is pretty compact. Vancouver is incredibly compact. Yep. You've also got a huge issue out west, which has really always grabbed my attention, which is we're not a headquarter city. Mm-hmm. So you look at Toronto.
Yes.
and you look at the average income in Toronto versus the average income in Vancouver, I think it's about 30,000 per person average difference, or 18,000 per person average difference, 30,000 per household.
Yep.
That's insane. That's massive. And so by not being a headquarters city, you're not attracting the talent. You're not having the money. Yet you're in a city that's ranked in the top 5 most expensive cities, if not the most expensive city in the world outside of Sydney.
Yeah. So why is that? Why do you think that is?
So I've been really lucky. I've gotten to talk to Andre Alliday from CBRE, and so that was a really fun conversation to figure this out. And then I've also gotten to talk to a bunch of CEOs.
Sure.
And it is the fact that if you look at it, Toronto is strategically placed to be close to Europe and to New York, right?
Yes.
The Vancouver epicenter was, and for us is a service city, is for LA.
Yeah.
So film industry, and then also tech, but tech gets pulled down south, so you get twice as much money.
Yeah.
The biggest thing they were saying is there's just a massive lack of labor pool here, which is bizarre because we have some pretty incredible companies that come out of here, like Slack started here.
Right.
You've got Arc'teryx that came out of here. You've got Lululemon that came out of here, but those companies are also migrating down south.
Yes.
Yeah, I think a huge amount of it has to do with taxation. I think that B, sure, you could say it's labor pool. I would also think that it has to do with like feasibility. Like you can live and afford to buy a home in California. You can't afford to buy a home in Vancouver off these rates. If you're making 30 to 40% more in California and your houses are 30 to 40% cheaper, your take home.
Well, certain parts of California.
Certain parts, yeah.
Because California also struggles from some of the same problems that we have up here in Canada from a taxation perspective. When you look at that as an overall state, right? Yeah. You do watch a lot of wealth now. These states actually leave California, right?
That's true. There's a massive exodus towards Texas.
Yeah, and so it does, and curious.
Canada's Alberta.
Very curious, right? You know, when you look at government's involvement in the ability for business to grow, and I mean, I think this has been one of the like lead talking points, you know, for Pierre Poilievre, you know, against Trudeau and now Carney, is the bureaucracy that is tied to being allowed to allow industry and competition inside of Canada, right? So we just had even this week, Carolyn Rogers from the Bank of Canada say that, you know, we need more competition amongst the banks here in Canada. And you've been listening to Trump talk about wanting access to the Canadian markets for, you know, multiple different industries. So I'm curious as to like, are we ever going to have more competition here in Canada? Because again, if we improved our taxation, you know, for companies, attracted more investment, right? And then allowed more competition, because almost all of our industries, you know, are oligopolies, like in terms of how they come in. It's literally all of them, right? So if we actually opened up the markets, it'd be better for consumers overall, would bring more money to Canada, you know, and our deficit wouldn't look anything like it looks like at the moment, right?
If there was something that you could leave, if there's a message you could leave to people who are interested in getting in the market, if there's a way to shift the perspective of the way people are looking at the market and ever buying a home, what is it that you'd want to say?
I think the key piece for Canadians that, you know, still have the dream of owning a home is to build a plan to be able to do it, right? So it's a major financial commitment to be able to purchase a property. You know, the down payment that you need to have, you know, you need to be able to save the financial, you know, burden of a home, right? You know, but you're going to be paying rent or you're going to be paying a mortgage anyways. And if you do want to have a family one day, you do have the dream of having a home and the security that's tied to it, you can still build a plan today to be able to own that home that you would like. And maybe you start today with a condo, and maybe one day it's the single family home that you always dreamed of, but you need to have a plan and a way to be able to accomplish it. Don't give up on it. You can still make it happen. You just might need somebody to help guide you to the end goal.
If there's somebody you could speak to in the mortgage industry, a broker who's sitting in the 10 to 20 range, they want to do what Pilot's achieved, what you and Damon have done, what is the takeaway message?
I think the takeaway message for anybody in any industry that is trying to grow beyond where they're at, you know, you've hit a certain ceiling, doesn't really matter where it is, you know, revenue or, you know, funded volume as a mortgage broker. It's to find a mentor, somebody that has already achieved what you have looked to achieve, and they can teach you the way to do it. You know, you can probably find your way there on your own, you know, bumbling over the next 5 to 10 years, or you can just find somebody in order to help you break through the ceiling that you have and teach you the things that they learned. And it's going to accelerate your growth. You know, you see this in business all the time, just your ability to be able to level yourself up by finding somebody above you, right? So it's really the key. And I think you see it across every entrepreneur.
You spoke earlier about the three things that really changed you and shifted your business. The first one was expanding your network and looking at your pipeline. The second one was developing systems that were repeatable and replicable. And the third one, which really hit home, is that it isn't about the transaction, it's about the lifetime relationship.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, I think when you look at Canadians today and consumers as a whole, right, the one piece that everybody is missing is a relationship, right? We all spend our time like flipping on our phones, right? You know, and you've lost like even the interaction maybe with your neighbors, right? So everybody is really looking for somebody that actually cares about them as a human being and that they can trust. And so, you know, for us in our business, being able to shift from, hey, I'm just trying to do your deal for you and get you what you want, to I actually care about you as a human. Tell me about yourself, what's important to you, what your goals are, and let's help you actually achieve those goals. It's meant a world of difference, not only for our clients, but for us as individuals, and how fulfilling it is for the work that we do to be able to see clients that go, you know, from maybe a single guy that bought his first place, and then him and his girlfriend buy their place, and then their first kid is on the way. And, you know, I just spoke with a guy last week that has $50,000 left on his mortgage and he's about to retire. And like, we've helped him ever since he purchased that place, you know, 20 years ago. Right. So it's super cool. Right. And I think that that's really the future of business as a whole, especially in any kind of industry like this, where, you know, you're servicing Canadians, is being able to actually care about them as human beings and help them achieve their goals.